I've always liked this parable, this image of the kingdom of God being like a woman who mixes yeast into flour and makes bread. I liked it because one of my favorite memories of childhood is coming home from school, getting off the school bus and walking into our home and being greeted by the smell of freshly baked bread. My mom would make about 6 loaves of bread nearly every week, and she would often time it so that the bread would still be warm when my brothers and I would get home from school. We'd cut a slice and slather on butter and homemade strawberry jam, and with a glass of cold milk. Who could ask for anything better? So when I first read this parable, the kingdom of God is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. I thought, what a lovely image. Jesus is saying that God's kingdom is like something that spreads like yeast and dough, that makes it rise and fills the room with tantalizing aromas that are hard to resist. But that's probably not what would have come to the minds of Jesus' listeners when they heard this parable. Jesus is saying something different from that. Of course, in biblical times, yeast wasn't these tiny granules that we use today. Yeast was more likely a lump of dough left over from a previous batch of bread, probably more like sourdough starch or something of that sort. And the leavening process was first discovered in Egypt, and leavened bread was a reminder of when the Israelites lived in Egypt and they were slaves. When they were told to leave Egypt, was leave it behind. Leavened bread is symbolically unholy. It is not acceptable for most temple offerings. Leavened bread is forbidden during Passover. But bread that didn't have yeast was holy bread. So why would Jesus say that the kingdom of God is like leaven, which makes bread unholy? In addition, Jesus said that the kingdom of God is like leaven that a woman took. And a woman? I mean, sure, women in that crowd that Jesus was speaking to undoubtedly had many important roles, caring for their families, making bread, cooking meals, getting water, but women were hardly equal to men. A woman, for example, could never be a priest. Now, suppose Jesus had started his parable saying, the kingdom of God is like a priest who took unleavened bread. Well, that would have made sense to people of where God was found. That would have fit with their understanding of what was holy, that God was found at the temple, a sacred place. But no, the kingdom of God is like leaven that a woman took. And then Jesus adds that the woman hid the leaven into the flour, which is an interesting verb. Something maybe subversive, unexpected is going on here. And finally, the leaven was hid in 3 measures of flour. Now, I always assumed that 3 measures of flour is kind of like 3 cups of flour and enough to make, 1 loaf of bread. But no, 3 measures of flour is approximately 23 kilos of flour. So take that big bag of 5 roses and add another one that same size, and add a little bit more, and you've got 3 measures of flour. Clearly enough to make bread for all of us and many more. So why such a huge amount of flour? Why would Jesus use that number? Well, if you were listening super carefully, you might have noticed that 3 measures of flour is the exact same amount of flour that Sarah took when the 3 men visited Abraham and Sarah at the Oaks of Mamre. Now, that would have been far more bread than 3 men could have possibly eaten. So it's an interesting amount of flour way back then. But only later did Abraham and Sarah realize that, oh, these were guests, visitors from God. And as promised, Sarah became pregnant with their son Isaac. So 3 measures of flour signaled to Jesus' listeners, who were clearly learning, they learned the scriptures orally. It was a signal that this is a moment when God is present, even when we do not know it. 3 measures of flour signaled that the result of this visit would go much, much farther than could have been imagined, impacting far more people than they would have ever thought possible. So in this teensy tiny, short parable, Jesus is confronting people's assumptions of what is holy and what is not, of where God is at work and what that might be like. However, yeast and women who bake bread don't particularly strike you and I as all that incongruent with God's kingdom. So I wondered, what kind of parable might Jesus say today if he were talking, say, to a group of Mennonites? Well, one possibility would be that Jesus might say that the kingdom of God is like a conservative Mennonite woman who wears one of those white prayer coverings and is preaching a sermon on Sunday morning. You see, I grew up on a farm in Kansas, surrounded by wheat fields, which are glorious in June, and also surrounded by the smell of hogs, which was not glorious in the slightest. Nearly everybody in my small community had roots in the Old Order Amish church. My family attended a conservative Mennonite church. I grew up wearing dresses and a covering, not just on Sundays, but every day, all the time. Women's roles in my church revolved around caring for children, making food, but a woman could never, ever preach, could certainly never lead worship, and this understanding is based on 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 and 35, which say, women should be silent in church. They are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law says. If there is something they want to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Well, and in a congregation that takes much of the Bible literally, and instructions are so clear, there was little need to wonder about this distinction between men and women's proper roles. Now, I'm very grateful, actually, for my years in that community and in that church. I did have a very good childhood. I had a sense of security, a sense of belonging. One of the gifts of that community was that we sang a lot, because we were in church a lot. And many, many old hymns live deep within me. And earlier this week, I was able to visit Carolyn Roth from this congregation. And if you know Carolyn, she is able to play the piano and organ just exquisitely. And although she suffers from Parkinson's, her medication gives her just a brief time of reprieve. And when I was visiting her, she was playing the piano, playing hymns that she had memorized. And because of my time in the conservative church, I could sing all of those hymns from memory. And the two of us just had a fabulous time together. But despite the strengths of the community, in my late teens, I became restless and I started taking university courses, which was unheard of in my congregation. Eventually, I graduated with a degree in elementary education, and during those years, I started attending a more mainstream Mennonite church. Admittedly, my parents were not happy with my decision to cut my hair and start wearing jeans, but they loved me. They knew that I still loved God, and they accepted me nonetheless. I was a teacher, teaching English teaching fifth grade for several years. Then I moved to Egypt, where I taught English with Mennonite Central Committee. Living in Egypt caused my theology to go through a lot of seismic shifts. I had a lot of questions about God and how God works in the world during my time there in Egypt. Following those years, I moved to Chicago, and there I worked at a small elementary school on the southwest side of the city. And many of the children that came to our school were quite poor. Their families faced all kinds of challenges, and my list of questions for God just got longer and longer. Like, how is Jackie ever supposed to have a chance in life when her mother is a prostitute in her own neighborhood? Or why do gangs flourish as they kill each other? And God, how do you just seemingly stand by silent with all the heartbreak that goes on in this world? Eventually, I was feeling battered and broken, and I knew I needed to move on. And as I considered various options, I decided I was going to go to seminary, because that would be a place where I could think about all these questions I had about God. I didn't know what I would do with a seminary degree, but I wanted to think. Well, to my surprise, people in my church just assumed, honestly, that I was going to be a pastor. And they gifted me with the Mennonite Minister's Manual. And I said, thank you, I guess. And I remembered that a couple of years earlier, a colleague had said to me, you know, you should be a pastor. And I scoffed. I thought that was the craziest thing I had ever heard. And I began to wonder what this might all mean. However, I assured my parents, who were still conservative Mennonites, that while I was going to go to seminary, I was not going to be a pastor. Do not worry. But I took a worship and preaching class my first year at seminary at AMBS, which is now Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Indiana. I loved it. And I wondered, should I reconsider? That summer, I did an internship at a church in Ohio to further explore whether becoming a pastor was indeed a call from God. And that August, my parents drove out to Ohio for a family reunion at a nearby camp. And that Sunday morning, I was invited to preach at the church, and I invited them to come if they would like to. I wasn't at all sure if they would. But despite the fact that they would have preferred that their daughter had become a mother instead of a pastor, and despite the fact that one of my aunts told my mother she should not go because she knew it was unbiblical for me to preach, and despite any reservations they might have had, my parents nonetheless came to hear me preach, giving me their blessing to become a pastor. The years that I have been a pastor have been some of the richest and most fulfilling ones of my life. And so here I am in a country that honestly I had said I would never move to because it was too cold, thanks to finding a sweet Canadian man at seminary. And I have the privilege of being a pastor among you, even although it is just a brief time. And that, my friends, is the kingdom of God at work. In this parable, Jesus is saying that the kingdom of God is found in the most unlikely places, in the most unexpected places, even in places that seem unholy. Indeed, it is often in these places of struggle and fermentation where God can bring the greatest growth. Like leaven, the growth in these places happens slowly, almost imperceptibly. But then one day you see it. You're preaching in the pulpit, and there your parents are sitting in the congregation, your mother wearing a covering and a smile on her face. As the angel said to Abraham and Sarah, "Is anything too wonderful for the Lord?" Over and over in our lives, in our communities, in our world, we experience trauma and grief and struggle. We see the destruction that is left in the wake of selfishness and greediness and physical illnesses, and we wonder, where is God and why? Why is God allowing this to happen? It takes faith to trust that God is truly active and working even in the midst of our struggles. It takes trust to believe that God, whose fingerprints of goodness and love can be seen all over the place if we're looking really carefully. And to believe that God's love is indeed growing within us, and God needs us to bear witness to this beauty in our world. Sometimes in the midst of life's hardships, our faith wavers. Mine does too. But sometimes faith that even is just the size of a small granule of yeast can be enough. Because we can always find God's kingdom in the middle of whatever is happening, especially when we confront what seems to us to be monumentally bad. Because what looks to us like disaster can be an opportunity to experience God at the deepest level. It can be an opportunity for us to be transformed. The living bread, the living Christ, is within us. The yeast of God will grow within us if we allow it to, if we open ourselves to be changed by Jesus Christ. And when it does, I dare say the aroma that arises will be like the smell of freshly baked bread wafting out of the oven, causing those around us to say, hey, I want some of that. So may God's grace grow within each one of us today. Amen.